This is Anna Massoglia. She is the editorial and investigations manager for OpenSecrets. Her specialization is dark money. And she has a really interesting and I imagine useful background. She studied both political science and psychology in school. So, and Anna, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Sure. I'm Anna Massoglia. I'm the editorial and investigations manager at OpenSecrets. That means that I do a lot of our editing, work with our reporting interns, help manage our reporting fellow, our reporter, and do a lot of the day-to-day with the communications department alongside our social media and outreach manager. I started for the first time at OpenSecrets in 2015 as a political nonprofits researcher, which means I research dark money. To go a little bit further back about how I came there, since I feel like that's probably of interest. I came from law school, which is not necessarily the most traditional route for journalism. I was looking for a way to use my skills in the policy and research and writing setting, and knew very quickly during law school that I did not want to practice, and stumbled across this position where they were looking for someone who could dig through tax returns, which is apparently a skill that can be useful in investigative journalism, I've learned over the years. And so kind of going into dark money, since it's really where I started and one of the things I find still most fascinating, and one of the research areas I really work to retain knowledge and keep up to date with is dark money. And I think it's something that's really useful no matter what field you're in, or what your beat is, I guess, because it is something that impacts all industries, all levels of government, in a variety of ways, and you'll kind of see that through this presentation. And I'll open for questions at the end to go into more depth about any of the things I've mentioned. So this is most typically politically active nonprofits, like I mentioned earlier. These are 501c4 nonprofits, is probably the most commonly known. These are supposed to exist for social welfare purposes. They're registered with the IRS as tax exempt. Contributions to them are not tax exempt, but they have a number of other advantages with the IRS, and one of the main advantages of routing money through these rather than through a political group for wealthy donors who would like to remain anonymous or don't want the flashy headlines of supporting a political candidate or a cause that might not help either their business or their personal life. They could have backlash. These can be the vehicle of choice for that type of political influence. Dark money groups have spent over $1 billion since Citizens United decision. That was the Supreme Court's decision in 2010 that really was one of the pivotal decisions, opening the door to dark money in politics and super PACs. There's a few others around that time, Speech Now and Right to Life. There's a few others that, in combination with Citizens United, really enabled dark money to just grow, but over the years we've tracked the spending reported directly to the FEC, which is where that $1 billion number comes from. When a group spends on ads, so when a 501c4 or any other group that does not disclose its donors spends on ads that say, vote for this candidate, don't vote for this candidate, we like this candidate, vote in this election, that type of ad, they're legally required to disclose those ads to what's called the Federal Election Commission. And sorry if I'm going a bit too basic. I figured it's better to explain stuff quickly up front so that no one's lost with the terms. The Federal Election Commission is the independent agency that is tasked with campaign finance oversight. There's a lot of other issues with it, but it is tasked with campaign finance oversight. And they are legally required to disclose that information. But they don't always. And I'm going to go into some of those loopholes later as well. Just to go into some of the additional types of dark money. So I talked about 501c4s just now being the most common type that do disclose to the Federal Election Commission. We also see other types of not just dark money, but politically active nonprofits under Section 501c of the IRS tax code. I won't go through all of the legal mumbo jumbo here, but we also have 501c groups, which are those charitable groups where if a donor gives to these groups, not only can they generally be anonymous, they also get a tax break for giving. The 501c groups are not allowed to engage in the same level of politicking that 501c4, the social welfare groups I mentioned earlier, are. They cannot spend on ads that say vote for, vote against. They can't feature candidates prominently in their ads other than within very restrictive settings. They can hold candidate forums. These 501c3s can do voter registration and get out the vote efforts. And in some cases, those have been accused of being partisan, of being very much in line or boosting C4s or boosting partisan interests. And so in some cases, even though a 501c3 is not legally allowed to be politically active, it can still help the other groups. With 501c4s, I mentioned that they are not required to disclose their donors, and they can spend just huge sums on politics. We're talking millions and millions of dollars. But one of the issues that has allowed this is the IRS has never really defined how much money is too much money for 501c4s to pour into politics. Their primary activity is supposed to be supporting social welfare, which is a somewhat clearly defined term. But even the term primary purpose is a bit, it is open to some interpretation when you talk to lawyers who have debated it right and left. And the de facto rule is that no more than half of all of the group's activities also being, how you define their activities also being something that people have argued over, should be devoted to politics, because politicking is not social welfare. That said, there are other ways the groups have made politicking look like social welfare. And I know that's super confusing, and I'll have some examples of that later. Just to quickly go into a couple other types of dark money groups, you also have limited liability companies or shell companies. These have been around for years, but more recently we really have started seeing them play a key role in political groups as donors, where you're seeing a number of limited liability companies in Federal Election Commission filings as the contributor, in some cases where they are not readily, it's not easy to find who they are actually tied to. And so in those cases, we would label those as shell companies. And that's one of the other ways that money can seep through. These are even more opaque than 501c4s because they don't file annual tax returns that are publicly disclosable. They do have some documents that they're required to disclose, but most of their records are not public in the same way that a 501c4's records are. They don't file a lot of the same documents that the 501c4 would. And you also have what are called non-entities, and this is just a term I threw together because I wasn't quite sure how to define these other emerging entities that we've just more recently started tracking. You have fiscal sponsorship, which are these fiscally sponsored projects. And this might be a bit too confusing at the start, but with 501c4s or 501c3s or other 501c groups, they may have a lot of different projects under their umbrella. And in some cases, groups may have projects under that are fiscally sponsored, which means they have their own identity. These look like independent groups, but they are legally the same entity as the umbrella, the fiscal sponsor 501c4. And so even though they look to the outside viewer, someone who sees an ad by them, oftentimes they will just list that group's name. They are not actually an independent group. Because of that, they also do not have to file separate tax returns. They may not have to file independent paperwork with the Federal Election Commission. There's not a lot of clarity about how those groups should be treated yet. And there's no standardized way for them to be disclosed across the board. Some states require them to be disclosed in corporation records, but that's not always that helpful since you don't get a breakdown of their spending even in their tax returns. And then digital spenders are another emerging way for money from opaque sources to really flow into our elections. Not all digital spending is opaque, and so obviously there's a lot of spending by political groups that do disclose their donors or may disclose even their spending to the FEC. But it is opened a door for these dark money groups that otherwise are trying to find ways to reach voters where it does not get tracked back to them or tracked back to their donors. And what is called micro-targeting means that these groups can spend on Facebook ads or Twitter, or I guess not Twitter ads anymore technically, but so Facebook ads or YouTube ads or a variety of other ads, and target them to a very specific type of person based on traits that they have. There has been, and because of that, the general masses are not seeing these ads. It's just the person they really want to see it. And this is how extremism can be stoked in some ways, or very specific contributions can be enlisted. How in some cases disinformation can spread among these very niche groups. And so that's another area that we've really started tracking. And then you also, as a part of that, see more just traditional political ad spending through online platforms like Facebook and YouTube by dark money groups, by those 501c4s. That's not always nefarious, just kind of your typical run-of-the-mill dark money, which is opaque and not ideal, but not necessarily as nefarious as what I was just describing. And so moving on, I'm not sure how we are with time.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I'm not leaving too much.
We have till 4.
Perfect. So we have a section of the OpenSecrets site called darkmoney.org. I know I speak quickly and I'm kind of skipping around with things, and this is a section of the site that has how-to guides. What is dark money? How does it work? It used to have a lot more data, but we lost the funding for certain sections of the site. But at this point, it has a lot of guides on it for anyone who is looking to dig into 501c4s, looking to dig into those networks, trying to figure out what the actual definitions are. And it's a great place to start if you're looking into a politically active nonprofit or a dark money group. We also track dark money spending through the Federal Election Commission section of our site. OpenSecrets, I probably should have started with what the organization does. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with OpenSecrets, but OpenSecrets tracks money in politics. We primarily work with tracking congressional elections, presidential elections, lobbying, political contributions, what's called outside spending, so spending by super PACs and in some cases dark money groups. And most recently, we've integrated state-level data for contributions, campaigns, and a variety of other things. And so one part of that is this outside spending that I mentioned. And with the outside spending, we manually assign disclosure labels to different groups as they come in from the FEC. You can get data directly from the Federal Election Commission, but we also have that data through OpenSecrets. And one of the advantages of going through our site is that we assign disclosure labels to the data, as well as deduping and a variety of other things to make it user-friendly. But we'll go through and see what level of disclosure each group has, not just in terms of what they've disclosed to the Federal Election Commission, but in terms of what donors they have. One thing that you'll notice, just to explain this chart, the red line is groups with no disclosure. And so this is like 501c4s that are spending and then directly reporting to the Federal Election Commission. You see this spike in 2010, but then you see this drop, which is kind of interesting and not what you would expect when I'm saying dark money is booming, but it still is. But not in the way you would think. We're seeing under disclosure to the FEC, but just booming dark money elsewhere. And so that presents a problem where these groups are just not reporting to the Federal Election Commission. And because of that, we have had to start piecing together different types of resources to get a more complete picture of the spending. And that's where the investigations come in. And just to look at a couple of the other lines, the green is obviously full disclosure. And then the blue line I find most interesting is some disclosure. So these are what are called partially disclosing groups. Most often these are groups like super PACs, which can raise and spend unlimited sums, but they're legally required to disclose their donors and they cannot coordinate it with candidates. One of the issues with how the rules are written with the Federal Election Commission is they can just disclose another organization as their donor, and that organization can be a dark money group or a shell company. And we are seeing a significant rise in dark money contributions. We tracked more than $1 billion in dark money during the 2020 election alone. This is a combination of digital ad spending, FEC-reported spending. So that the 88 million being FEC-reported spending, so that's the direct spending by 501c4s, and primarily 501c4s, that they reported to the FEC on their own, and then contributions from political groups, or to political groups, and that's the amount given by shell companies and dark money groups to super PACs in the far left. But then we also tracked really significant amounts of TV spending and digital ad spending that was not disclosed to the Federal Election Commission. And this was one of the other, and this is a conservative estimate. It's likely that it is much larger. This was just based on the digital ad platforms that disclose. Digital ad platforms are under no obligation to disclose spending on their platforms for political data. And the FEC does not legally require disclosure of digital ad data in the same way they do other types of ads. And so we were able to piece that together to some extent from platforms like Facebook, Snapchat, and Google, but many other platforms do not disclose, so we don't know the full scope of how much was spent on those platforms. With TV ad spending, we looked at Kantar, and that was kind of the easiest for us, and then deduped based on any groups that had reported to the Federal Election Commission. One of the issues with the TV spending and the reason that it was not all disclosed to the Federal Election Commission is a lot of it was electioneering communications. These are what are called issue ads as opposed to independent expenditures. So independent expenditures are the type of ads I mentioned earlier where you see these so-called magic words that was by Buckley v. Valeo being the Supreme Court case. And you'll see defeat, vote for, elect, vote against, or some equivalent of those words. And if you use those words in an ad, that is considered express advocacy or an independent expenditure, and that is legally required to be disclosed to the FEC, whether it is a TV ad, a radio ad, or an online ad. But when you get into electioneering communications or these issue advocacy ads where you're saying, thank your senator's a problem, your senator's awesome, we hate your senator kills puppies. That type of thing is totally fair game. I actually just saw recently a bus. I should have added it to this, but I just saw it this week. Probably the most shocking to me example of an issue ad was a bus just driving around town with one of the candidates' faces turned into the devil. And that is perfect, and with, I can't remember what it said on it, but because they avoided ever saying vote for or vote against, they used the man's name and they're like, yeah, he's the devil. And that's, I think they actually said whatever his name was the devil. And that is perfectly fair game for issue ads. And you do not legally have to disclose that spending to the Federal Election Commission unless it's within 60 or 30 days of an election, depending on whether it's a special election or a general election or a primary election. And so in that very short period during the last few weeks of an election cycle, you do have to disclose the issue ads where you mention a candidate. So any ad that mentions a candidate on a traditional platform has to be disclosed to the Federal Election Commission. But if it is online ads, the Federal Election Commission has a loophole there where even online ads that mention candidates up to the day of the election, if they do not use these magic words or the equivalent, they are not legally required to be disclosed to the Federal Election Commission. And so you can run online ads much more freely with much less disclosure. And one of the issues presented by that is, I'm sure y'all use social media and the internet to some extent, is online ads don't necessarily lend themselves to stopping and saying vote for, vote against, defeat. These are often images and memes and videos and integrations. They're not just the traditional political ad where you sit, you watch a video, and then it has a disclaimer at the end that says vote for, vote against. And so the vast majority of online ads do not have that language. And so most of them just aren't disclosed to the Federal Election Commission when they're run by dark money groups. And we have an explainer video in the corner more about kind of the differences between express advocacy and issue ads through OpenSecrets. And we can send around the presentation at the end if anyone wants this. And then going back to the outside spending of what is actually disclosed to the FEC, this is all on the OpenSecrets site. You can see who the top spenders are. This includes both super PACs and disclosing groups that do disclose their donors, as well as dark money groups. I don't know how well you can see it on here, but there's a little circle next to the names of these groups. Sometimes it's a half circle, sometimes it is a fully black circle, and sometimes it's empty. And that shows whether or not there's full disclosure. If it's a full circle, that means they're fully disclosing. This group discloses all their donors. If it's half black, half white, it's half disclosing. And if it's just fully white, it's non-disclosing. They don't disclose at all. And so that way you can tell as you're looking through what that is. You have the total there, and then you also have the view, which is either liberal, conservative, or in some cases third party, and in some cases nothing. Because you also will see business groups that don't necessarily take a partisan allegiance also spending here, and sometimes pretty significant amounts. And we also have a lot of charts just so you can see things over time, and a lot of other ways to slice and dice this. And please feel free to reach out if you want another way to slice and dice it. We have a lot of data available internally as well. Just to give a quick comparison of FEC-reported spending versus total dark money, on the left is the last page. If you see the chart in the lower left corner, that's this for just the non-disclosing groups. And the right is the total dark money we calculated for the 2020 election cycle. As you can see, the top dark money spender that reported spending to the Federal Election Commission reported just $17 million, which again, not chump change. I'm not going to see $17 million. But when you look at the total dark money on the right, the top spender based on their political contributions to super PACs and their ads, which were not reported to the Federal Election Commission, was $125 million, which is a huge jump. This group, One Nation, actually reported no spending to the Federal Election Commission during the 2020 cycle. None of their issue ads were disclosed. They spent on issue ads for most of the cycle, and then the day that, it was either the day of or 2 days before the date that would trigger disclosure, they stopped spending and started giving to their super PAC. And so it's very brazen in some cases how this operates. They have the One Nation has a closely tied super PAC called Senate Leadership Fund, and so they give most of their money to them when they would otherwise be required to disclose their donors. And so you see these multiple channels of influence. And so just FEC-reported spending doesn't tell the whole picture. It's also those other political contributions and ads. And that's just a prettier version of that. Looking at overall dark money sources, this is really where you get into the investigative journalism. Because the FEC has so many issues with what is disclosed to it, not because of the Federal Election Commission, but because so many groups do not disclose information or disclose their information completely. We have looked to a number of other sources in order to get a more complete picture of dark money groups. Here you can see some of the sources we most commonly rely on. In the far left, you can see LM2 filings. This is from the Department of Labor. These are primarily for unions. They show what payments unions make in some cases to political groups. So you can see donations from unions to super PACs or in some cases to dark money groups. And so that's one way we see the financial information. In the middle here, you actually can see what information you find from each of these. And I have a line drawn to where you look for it. So you can go either from looking at the place, or if you know what you're looking for, you can see where you can find it. And I find this to be really useful to have. I actually keep a printed out version of this on my desk so that I can remember where to find things. But then we also have the Federal Election Commission, which is good for campaign finance reports, and the Statement of Organization, which provides information about the people and leadership and contact information. There are multiple different places that you can find contact information. Sometimes different agencies have different contact information for the same group, different people reported for the same group. And so checking multiple different agencies, multiple different types of disclosures, even if you've already found a person or already found some of the information that you think is useful, can still have utility, because you might find another person If you really are trying to get that picture of the group, some might disclose an additional board member or another consultant or a phone number that wasn't in the other, and oh, it turns out this phone number belongs to this person. And in some cases that can be helpful, and in some cases it's not, and they report the same thing to everyone or nothing to everyone. And then we've got state-level agencies where you have state-level campaign finance reports. These can be outside spending at the state level, similar to what the outside spending looks like at the federal level, as well as contributions from those groups sometimes to federal groups, and so kind of like seeing that money pass between each other. Other state level resources include incorporation documents, where not all politically active nonprofits are incorporated, but many are. And so if you can figure out what state they're incorporated in, you can get their incorporation documents. One of the issues with this is many of the more opaque nonprofits are incorporated in states like Delaware, where you can just pay an agent to file your paperwork on your behalf, or a company that professionally acts as your corporate agent. And so there's very little information on the filings themselves. But if you go to, so with Delaware, what information they have on their website is very sparse, but you can actually contact the clerks there and ask for more information, ask for the formation documents. And in Delaware in particular, I've had really good luck with the people there. They've always been so nice, and they'll usually send the formation documents, and sometimes those will have signatures on them from whoever is actually in charge of the company, other people who are actually involved in the company. And sometimes it's a waste of time, but it's about 50-50, I guess. But sometimes you will even get attorneys who are involved, that type of thing. Moving on to a few other sources, we also have the Internal Revenue Service, which has Form 990 tax returns. These are really one of the core resources that we use for looking at information from nonprofits. We've used these for a number of years. One of the issues with 990s is you don't get them for 5.5 months after their fiscal year is over, so you're oftentimes waiting long after the election to see what information you have about them. But you can also collect what's called a Form 1023 or a Form 1024. These are their application materials with the IRS. Not all groups file these because 501c4s can file a notice with the IRS instead, which is not publicly disclosable, but if you request a 1023, or a 1023 being for a 501c3, a 1024 is for a 501c4. So if you request these from the groups and they say they do have them, they're legally required to give them to you. They can charge up to 20 cents a page, but they're legally required to give them to you. And in some cases, these application materials can provide information about initial funding for the groups, addresses, board members, sometimes even correspondence with the IRS about what preceded them getting tax-exempt status. One time I got one that was over 1,000 pages long, and that was quite a journey. And the IRS Business Master File is just the IRS's data for pretty much everything. The 990s, the 1023s, and the 1024s, pretty much everything is in there. So if you prefer to query things, download bulk data rather than looking through documents, if that's something that you're interested in, you can just get that from the IRS. And I'm not going to say it's really easily usable, but it's a really helpful thing to have because you can dig much more into the standardized data that they do have. And then on the other side here, we have LD 203 contribution reports. You can get these from Congress. These are where lobbyists and groups that have lobbied report contributions from lobbyists or from corporate PACs, and these come in, I believe, quarterly, and they're submitted to the US Congress, and so you can get those sometimes before Federal Election Commission filings come out and see when, for example, a company might be funding a dark money group, because these include, in some cases, not just political contributions to groups that are registered with the Federal Election Commission, but in some cases may include advocacy groups, like 501c4s and other groups that don't disclose their donors. And then over here you have all of course, the digital ads, Facebook and Snapchat and Google. I still have Twitter over here because we do have an archive of it, and sometimes looking back at the archive, we can get some address and contact information, even though they're no longer running political ads. And then from the Federal Communications Commission, it's a bit harder to use, but they do track political ads and issue ads. They have what's called the public file that includes a number of documents for every ad buy that goes through a station. So anytime an issue ad or a political ad is bought from a station, it goes there. You have to file what's called an NAB, like a National Association of Broadcasters form, and that can include what the issue is on the ad, the board members for the group, and in some cases even more information, as well as, of course, the spending numbers, and even what shows they're trying to run the ad on. And so sometimes that can be really interesting to look at.
I was curious about the tools on the website. So I know that you can look up donors, but can you do the reverse? Like, can you look up a candidate and then see the donors?
Yes.
Rather than, okay.
Yes, so you can look it up either way on OpenSecrets. You can see, is it okay if I drink water?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. You can go either way. So you can look up a group on OpenSecrets, like a super PAC. You can look up a candidate. You can look up your member of Congress or your senator, or anyone running for Congress, and then you can see who their donors are. So you can go both ways and either type the name of a donor in on the donor lookup, or you can search the name of the group and go back that way and see who their top donors are. When you go based on the group, you can also see where who their top industries are, who their top sectors are. So we'll break it down by if they have a number of people. So companies cannot give directly to campaigns. They can give to super PACs and outside groups, but it's a common misconception that companies can give directly to campaigns. They can't. Corporate PACs can, and people affiliated with companies can. And so if you see a lot of people affiliated with companies, we may note trends of people in that industry giving, that type of thing. So there's a lot of information looking up the group as well.
And then these folks will actually be meeting with one of the FEC commissioners next week. If it were you, what would you ask them?
That's a good question. Which commissioner is it?
Shannon Broussard.
Oh, that's a really good question. I'd want to know more about their plans for online advertising disclosure and disclaimers, and how they're weighing the potential burden on campaigns and the feasibility of sub-vendor disclosure with that, since in many cases the campaigns and the political groups are not the ones buying the advertising. It's their vendors, and so how they're trying to consider the sub-vendor issues presented by online advertising disclosure and disclaimers.
Yeah.
I know that's very niche, but...
No, yeah. Is it okay if we open it up to questions?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Rashad with Nexstar Media. Thank you for joining us today. How effective would you say dark money ads are? Because when we typically think of this, we think of negative ads, and you gave some examples. How effective is this in terms of like state politics? Because we're getting into the midterms.
That's a good question. It's hard to tell how effective the ads are on their own, since you have, looking at specific elections, you have multiple different elements at play. You have oftentimes other groups that are spending on that same election. Just in terms of receptiveness to dark money ads versus other types of ads, oftentimes they tend to be, dark money ads are more likely to be attack ads than candidate ads or even super PAC ads, possibly because of that anonymity where the donors are not known and it's just much more of an opaque vehicle. And so you'll oftentimes see these much more biting ads. And so I don't know if that makes them more effective or not. You'll also oftentimes see outside groups and dark money groups spend more heavily in high profile races in key states where you're already seeing this huge pool of funding for candidates and from other outside groups. So it's hard to say how much impact that dark money group has specifically. I can think of a couple examples where dark money groups highly correlated with election wins and where their head of the dark money group actually took credit for a win. My favorite example of this is a group called Carolina Rising in North Carolina a few years ago during Thom Tillis's, or Yeah, it was Tom Tillis's first election. It popped up shortly before the election and was run by this political operative. It was very opaque, run out of PO boxes and very difficult to track, and spent, I think, over 5 million. I think it was 4.5 million. And there's a video of the political operative on election night at Tom Tillis's victory party. I think he had a few too many, saying 4.5 million, we did it. And so in some cases, there is that smoking gun, but that is very rare. And more often you see that correlation, but in particular with those bigger races, it's hard to say this is effective because there's so many other elements, but you can certainly say this is big money, and this is a part of it.
My name's Ryan Taranelli, and I had a question. You actually helped me out with getting a form a little while ago, and that was really helpful. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you meant by the congressional releases, as far as, like, you know, you mentioned something in your slide about how there could be, like, congressional, like, their dark money groups have to report when they're giving to certain candidates through a congressional release. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. Is that the LD 203 that I was mentioning?
I think so, yeah.
Sure. So it's not actually the dark money group disclosing there. It's actually the lobbyists for corporations or for clients, where they disclose all of their contributions. And they have to disclose that because they're lobbyists. And is a part of that is disclosing contributions to advocacy groups. And so you will see their contributions to dark money groups often.
So it's a lobbyist telling Congress who they're working for. Is that right?
You'll see who they're working for, but you'll also see who they're giving to. So you'll see if, for example, either the lobbyist or the corporation they're working for then gave money to a 501c4. So 501c4s could have a lot of different donors. It could be people, it could be corporations. They're all a secret, but they could be a lot of different things. And one of the ways that we try to piece together their donors is by looking at disclosures actually from the donor side. You're more likely to find that than from the group itself. And in this case, you're seeing disclosures from a lobbyist who, let's say they work for a corporation, and let's say the lobbyist gave $1,000 to the dark money group and the corporation gave $500,000. They would have to disclose both of those things in the LD 203.
Oh, so it's almost a sidestepping way that because the lobbyist is engaging with Congress, that's why they had to report the money that's provided by the dark money group. Right.
Yeah, provide to the dark money group. So that's not going to the lobbyist, it's going from the lobbyist to the dark money group.
Yeah, because they're engaging with Congress, that's requiring them to disclose the influence of the dark money group through the company interest.
One additional disclosure that I actually don't have mentioned on here because it's not a one-stop shop official form of disclosure, but that I also find really useful similar to that is voluntary corporate disclosures. The Center for Political Accountability does a really great job tracking them, where in some cases corporations have taken it upon themselves to disclose their political contributions, their trade association memberships and dues paid, as well as contributions to groups like 501c4s and even charities. And they will post annual reports or semi-annual reports on their websites. And so that's another thing that can be really helpful in a very similar way to the LD 203s.
Can you walk us through some of the enforcement methods or any teeth that the FEC has to kind of police all this? Because it seems like the last few years they've been, you know, a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest, like just completely hamstrung and everything.
Yeah. Well, the FEC currently has what's called a quorum, at least, which is a step in the right direction. For a very long time, the FEC didn't have enough commissioners to even vote on any enforcement action. And so that's at least a step in the right direction, that they have enough commissioners. The Senate is currently considering another commissioner, and so we may have even one more. I'm not sure when the vote is on that, or it might have already happened and I missed it, but at some point soon, I think that there's going to be a new FEC commissioner who was nominated by Biden. But in terms of actual enforcement, there can be fines. Usually that's preceded by a letter from the Federal Election Commission. If you go to FEC.gov and look through each group's page there, you can see all of their filings, and one of those would be any letters they've received from the FEC. I believe it's called RFAIs usually, and so anytime the FEC flags that a campaign has received too many contributions or something doesn't match, sometimes it's called something different, sometimes it's just a miscellaneous form, but you'll see the FEC will actually flag that. And so that can be something really interesting to track also, looking in through those filings. FEC Notify, which is one of the features that the FEC.gov has, you can actually set up notifications for different types of documents. And so you can set up notifications for any time someone receives a letter from the Federal Election Commission. That can sometimes be annoying and it's like little things, but it can also sometimes be very fruitful. And so that type of thing I would recommend for if you're trying to track enforcement. They also have matters under review, so MURs. You can see all of those on the FEC.gov site. Those can drag on for very long time, years in some cases. In rare instances, donors may be required to be disclosed. Groups may be required to register as political committees. In some cases, there are even criminal prosecutions from the Department of Justice if a case is egregious. Obviously fines, and in some cases civil issues are raised, but that's rare. We're seeing it more frequently recently though, but usually those are in the more egregious cases.
Are they equipped to handle this changing world of dark money and everything? Are they playing catch up right now?
That's a good question for the FEC commissioner who's coming. I'd like to think that they're trying to be. I think that there is so much that needs to be done in terms of keeping up with new technology. It's one of the challenges that's really posed by dark money groups and by online ads and new technology generally with political spending is that there are constantly new tactics coming out. With dark money groups, as soon as they've been figured out, one of their methods of hiding has been figured out, they just find a new one. And so that really presents a whole number of challenges to our job as journalists and investigators to figuring those out, but also to the Federal Election Commission and that enforcement. And so I could see where, especially within the government, that can be a little slower of a process, but I think the challenges of new technology certainly present some issues.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel.
Hi, Daniel DeRocher from the Kansas City Star. So I have two questions. One is about 990 forms. Often, like when you go on GuideStar, they're years behind. Do you have a place that you can get your most up to date rather than just kind of relying on GuideStar?
Sure. I don't know if you're going to like the answer, but so the IRS does have a search, but again, they're going to be a little bit not up to date. They're usually about a year, posted about a year later. If you want them the day they are filed, I'm just going to go on and show because this is actually next. You can go to a group and request them. Do I have the request form on here? Yes, I don't. Well, so you can basically go to a group and request them from the group themselves. Oh. If you find the group's address and they have an open physical office and they have normal business hours, you can actually go there and they have to give it to you same day. This is not common right now because of COVID, and that has made my job a lot harder with trying to get these 990s because most places just say they don't have normal business hours anymore, at least in person. But if you can find an in-person office that has normal business hours and is open, that's one way to do it. Otherwise, you can call them, they can request, or they can ask that you submit a written request. They can ask you to submit an actual letter, not just an email request. And then that tolls 30 days. They have 30 days to reply to you, and they still legally have to send it to you. If a group is not playing ball, which sometimes is the case, and they just are completely non-responsive, the IRS has a way to request them as well. I believe it's form 5054A, and that is something that you can request both the 1024 and 1023 forms, as well as the form 990s. One thing that I would recommend when you're requesting the forms from the groups themselves or from the IRS is to specify that you also want the Schedule B. It'll be a redacted Schedule B. They no longer disclose the names of the donors or their addresses, but they do disclose the amounts still in the Schedule B. And so you can actually see whether a group is fully funded by a single multi-million-dollar donation or a number of smaller donations. And so that can sometimes be really interesting as well.
Yeah, and then obviously dark money groups are set up so that we can't see who's donating to them. Are there any common ways that you see them trip up where you may be able to get into, or see something that that they're trying to hide? Like, are there any things pitfalls that they often fall into that we can take advantage of?
One time an accountant sent us an unredacted Schedule B, and they were not pleased that we used it, but it was very much their mess up. No, so sometimes they slip up and they do actually send you information they're not supposed to. I don't know if there's a good way to go around that and get the information. I think relying on the other resources is really the best way to do it. Go on the up and up, at least for me. I've always found that to be the most reliable, is cross-checking all the information. I don't trust when something's just in one document completely. It always makes me nervous that they might be lying in one document versus another, because so many times I've seen things reported in a tax return and it be different than what's reported in their FEC filings or in an incorporation record, and there's different people in one of their other documents. And so making sure to check all of those different sources, the ones that are listed up here being a good starting point, whatever's relevant for that, depending on what information you're looking for.
And I'm Rachel. With STAT, and I just wanted to ask about like the Form 990 forms, because I know sometimes I run into the situation where there's like a group running ads on the radio or something, it's clearly a front group, but on the 990s it only discloses like donations to other organizations. So then you're like trying to piece it together, and you might have some suspects, but it's just kind of like a stab in the dark as to tracing backwards. So I was wondering if you have any like search mechanisms or anything that you found particularly helpful in trying to tease that out in a more efficient way.
Of trying to figure out who the radio funders are?
Yeah, if there's like a 501c4, and sometimes with the nonprofits, like there is disclosure, but sometimes it's a little more indirect.
In particular, if you're listening to a group on the radio, I would recommend starting with the Federal Communications Commission disclosures, because every time something is run, they do have to file there, even if it's just an issue ad. And so that would include front groups. And they have to file their board members, their address, and what the issue of national importance mentioned in the ad is. One of the great things about some stations is they actually go in and cross out the issue of national importance that the group reported and fix it, where you'll see they said the issue was taxes. The issue is actually the election, and you'll see the stations fix it for us. And it's really fascinating to look through some of those. I would highly recommend starting there. In terms of donors, I would just recommend looking at the other sources as well. It depends on what kind of group it is. If it's an industry group, looking at voluntary corporate records, maybe looking at the LD-203s. If it's a union-related group, looking at the LM2 filings. Those are always a good place to start if it's either corporate tied or industry tied, or looking at other 990s can also be helpful. So other groups' tax returns, while they don't have to disclose incoming donations, they do have to disclose grants. And so you see all of the outgoing money from 501c4 groups to other groups. And it is extremely common for 501c4s to have networks where they will pass money between each other. And when a new group pops up, it may be fully funded by an existing group. And so that's another way to see if there might be a donor in there. And even if it's not a new group, there's histories of a number of donations. Sometimes a group may be funded by 5 or 6 different dark money groups in any given year.
Anna, thank you so much.
Thank you.